Now, we talked about the top three John Dorsey moves. Let's look at the bottom three, the worst three moves that John Dorsey made.
Well, we got to start with the guy we just talked about, right? Freddie Kitchens. And I'll be honest, at some point I probably bought myself into Freddie Kitchens. I'm sure some old takes exposed account out there can go find some glowing column I wrote about Kitchens, but the reality is it became clear pretty quickly this guy was in over his head. And it wasn't Freddie Kitchens' fault. It was John Dorsey's fault for choosing him and putting him in that position, and that's why the Browns went 6-10.
And you know, you make a really valid point. It wasn't too long before you kind of sat there and said, what are you doing? You know, especially with the play calling.
Well, like week one, when they come out and lose 43-13 and commit 18 penalties, or at least have 18 penalties accepted against them, it became very obvious that maybe this wasn't going to work pretty quickly.
And all right, so Freddie Kitchens, and that one probably ultimately cost John Dorsey his job because it sounded like he didn't want to cede any power, especially into a potential new coaching search. And there are even some reports that he wanted to bring Freddie Kitchens back.
Yeah, I think there was some support in the front office to maybe bring Kitchens back for a second year and see if he could develop into the job. But the reality is that year 3 for Baker Mayfield is just too important. You cannot risk bringing Freddie back. And I think that may be why John Dorsey is not here.
All right, so too much Freddie Kitchens. Then the second thing that you thought was kind of a downfall, just too much risk.
Yeah, and especially with a guy like Antonio Callaway, right? Like you take the gamble on Kareem Hunt, you bring him in, and it works. But then you rely way too much on a guy like Antonio Callaway, and it was just obvious that this was a guy you could not rely on. And then you bring him back against San Francisco, he drops that ball on the goal line, he's not lining up in the right places. He's still playing after that over and over and over again until they finally decided to waive him before the Steelers game on that Thursday night. Just relying too much on a guy like that because he was too important to this team. He couldn't be your third wide receiver. He needed to be down the depth chart a little bit, especially once he got suspended in training camp. That should have been all you needed to know. When he was gone those first 4 games, you should have known we can't rely on this guy. And John Dorsey just relies too much on guys that bring some character baggage.
The other thing that's interesting is a guy like Rashard Higgins, who was Baker Mayfield's security blanket, a guy who he had a really good understanding with, disappeared. I mean, I think the last pass thrown to him was a touchdown that won a game. How bizarre is that?
It was strange, and you know he was inactive the last game of the season, and clearly there was something going on there between him and Kitchens. But that was also some inconsistency, right? Because Callaway kept showing up out there. There were other guys who maybe made mistakes or things like that kept showing up out on the field, but Rashard Higgins couldn't get out there. Kareem Hunt, obviously, his emergence was a big reason for that as well. He kind of became your third wide receiver. But when you start to rely on guys like Callaway too much, it's going to come back and burn you.
And then, the third thing that was not a good move for John Dorsey. The third of the three never really addressed the offensive line.
Yeah, that was the biggest issue. Obviously, trade Kevin Zeitler for Olivier Vernon, and that trade at this point has not worked out because Vernon was hurt for most of the second half of the season. You know, he played okay in the first half, but you give up a guy like Kevin Zeitler, and you never really have a plan to replace him. You thought maybe it would be Austin Corbett, who you spent the number 33 pick on. Well, now he's part of the LA Rams, and he was playing there. You know, so maybe there was a way to get Corbett on the field. But your left tackle is shaky, your right tackle is shaky, your right guard was shaky. You got a great center, you got a great left guard. You can build something in this offensive line, but you gambled too much with Greg Robinson, and you never addressed the right guard situation. And Baker Mayfield was running for his life.
And then I think the other thing about that offensive line that comes back to it is you can design plays that minimize it, and they never did.
Yeah, and that was one of the victories of the last 8 games of 2018 was the offensive line actually played pretty well, and a lot of it was because of the scheme and the play calling. But then you come back in 2019, and all of that is gone. It's funny what happens when defensive coordinators who work 100-hour weeks can sort of start to adjust for you and figure out your tendencies and what you want to do as a play caller.
So I guess the big question is it better after John Dorsey put his stamp on it than it was when he came in?
Yeah, even though you can make a real case that maybe it was time to move on from John Dorsey, especially if he was going to tie himself so closely to Freddie Kitchens, I do think the roster is better than when John Dorsey took it over. And I think whoever takes this roster over, and we learned, beware of expectations on paper, right? But this roster is really good, and I think with a better coach, this team could have won 8, 9, 10 games, depending on the level of coach this year. So I think the roster is good enough to make the playoffs. You've just got to get the right people in charge. And of course, look, you've got to address the O-line, you've got to address some holes on defense, but the roster is better than when John Dorsey took over.